The smoke used to start before sunrise on the 4th, not the fireworks, the pit. Somebody's uncle was out there at 5 in the morning turning meat in the dark, and by the time the sun came up, the whole block could smell it. The folding tables came out, the card tables, the ironing board with a tablecloth thrown over it because there were never enough surfaces. Every woman brought a dish wrapped in aluminum foil and set it down without a word because everybody already knew what she was bringing. Number 22 on this list held the plate together with nothing but cornmeal and patience. Number 8 on this list started more family debates than the card game. The grocery store killed some of these. The fast food chain finished off the rest. Hit subscribe because here are 30 4th of July soul food dishes black families want back. Number 30, corn pudding. Fresh corn cut straight off the cob was stirred into a batter of eggs, butter, sugar, and milk, poured into a baking dish, and baked until the top browned and the center set like custard. It was not quite a vegetable and not quite a dessert. The texture sat between the two, and nobody tried to classify it. Corn pudding held its place on 4th of July tables from the 1940s through the 1980s across the rural South, where July meant the corn was at its peak, and the women who made it knew by feel how much sugar the batch needed without measuring a single thing. Fresh sweet corn from the garden was what made the dish. The canned version that replaced it turned corn pudding into something flat and not worth heating up the oven. Number 29, smoked turkey legs. A whole turkey leg, brined overnight in salt water and sugar, smoked low over hickory until the skin turned dark mahogany and the meat pulled clean from the bone. Turkey legs were pit food. They went on the smoker alongside the ribs in the early hours and came off just before the table was set. Men standing around the fire ate them first, one hand on the bone, the other holding a napkin that was never enough. The leg was big enough to be a meal by itself and cheap enough to smoke a dozen for the whole yard. By the late 1980s, smoked turkey legs showed up mostly at county fairs, sold at prices that would have bought the whole bird a generation earlier. The backyard version, seasoned by the family and smoked before dawn, cost almost nothing and tasted like it meant something. Number 28, pickled peaches. Peaches picked firm were peeled and simmered whole in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and whole cloves until they turned soft and translucent. The jars were sealed weeks before the 4th and brought out cold, straight from the back of the refrigerator. They were served alongside the meat, not the dessert. The sweetness cut through the smoke and the salt on the plate. The vinegar kept them honest. Pickled peaches came from a time when every fruit had a second life in a jar, and the women who made them planned a holiday months before it arrived. The process required a kitchen built for standing on a hot afternoon, a stock pot, and jars that were saved and reused until the glass chipped. When home canning stopped being routine, the pickled peaches stopped with it. Nobody bought a jar to replace them. Number 27, Mississippi mud cake. Mississippi mud cake was a sheet cake made with cocoa, butter, and pecans, baked in a wide pan and covered in marshmallows while still hot from the oven. The marshmallows melted into the surface and were sealed under a layer of warm chocolate frosting poured on top. The result was dense, sticky, and rich enough to stop conversation mid-sentence. It traveled well, which made it the ideal cookout cake. A woman could bake it the night before, cover the pan in foil, and carry it across the yard without worrying about frosting sliding off in the July heat. The name came from the dark layered look of the chocolate, marshmallow, and pecans, which resembled the silty banks of the Mississippi after a summer rain. Mississippi mud cake disappeared from cookout tables when chocolate cake went from a from-scratch event to a grocery store bakery purchase. Number 26, fried croaker. Croaker was a bottom-feeding saltwater fish that ran cheap along the Atlantic coast from the Chesapeake to North Florida. The fish was small enough to fry whole, dipped in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped into hot oil in a cast iron Dutch oven set up in the yard. The skin crisped into a thin shell. The white meat underneath stayed moist and carried a faint sweetness from the sea. Fried croaker was a coast and low country cookout tradition stretching back generations. Families near the water caught them that morning with a cane pole and a bucket. Families inland bought them packed on ice from a truck that made rounds through the neighborhood on Fridays and before holidays. When the fish trucks stopped running in the 1980s, fried croaker at the 4th of July went with them. The grocery store never stocked what that truck carried. Number 25, 3-bean salad. Green beans, kidney beans, and wax beans were drained, tossed with sliced onion, vinegar, sugar, and oil, and left to sit overnight in the refrigerator. The salad was served cold in a glass bowl and placed between the heavier dishes on the table. It was sharp, sweet, and simple. The only real disagreement was over whether the onions should be raw or softened in the dressing first. 3-bean salad showed up at church suppers and 4th of July cookouts through the 1970s and 1980s, carried in a covered bowl with plastic wrap stretched tight across the top. It cost almost nothing to make and stretched to feed as many people as showed up. When cookout sides shifted toward creamy dips and store-bought trays in plastic containers, the vinegar salads were the first to be left behind. The Black 4th of July cookout could never be purchased. Thanksgiving had the butterball turkey. Christmas had the spiral-cut ham. Easter could be handled with a caterer, but the 4th required a community, not a receipt. The pit had to be built or borrowed. The sides came from 6 kitchens. The desserts were assigned weeks in advance. The men stood around the fire. The women commanded the table. The children ran between both. No restaurant replicated what those tables held because the food was never the full point. The gathering was the point. The food was proof the gathering was real. And when families scattered and the grandparents died, the cookout did not survive the distance. Number 24, smothered chicken. Smothered chicken took up the entire stove. A whole bird cut into pieces, seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, browned hard in a cast iron skillet, then buried under a thick onion gravy made from the drippings. The lid went on. The heat dropped low. The kitchen filled with the smell that pulled people in from the yard. After more than an hour, the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, and the gravy soaked into whatever it touched. At a 4th of July spread, smothered chicken was for people who did not eat pork. It never felt like a second choice. By the 1990s, boneless, skinless breasts replaced the whole bird in most homes. The gravy was the first thing to go. Number 23, candied yams. Candied yams were not sweet potatoes from a can with marshmallows melted on top. That was the magazine version. The real version started with fresh yams, peeled and sliced thick, layered in a baking pan with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a splash of vanilla extract. They baked covered until the sugars melted into a syrup that bubbled at the edges and turned the yams soft enough to cut with a spoon. The color was deep amber. The taste sat between dessert and side dish without committing to either one. Every family held an opinion about whether to add orange juice, and every opinion was treated as settled law. The microwave version that arrived in the 1990s ruined a generation's understanding of what this dish was supposed to be. Number 22, spoon bread. Spoon bread was closer to a souffle than to cornbread. Coarse ground cornmeal cooked in boiling milk until thick, then beaten with eggs, butter, and salt until the batter turned smooth and airy. It went into a greased dish and into the oven until the top rose golden and the center held a custard-like tremble. It came out with a spoon, not a knife. At a cookout, spoon bread absorbed the juices from the meat and the potlikker from the greens with a refinement cornbread never had. The dish had roots older than the Republic. Enslaved cooks in Virginia and the Carolinas adapted indigenous corn preparations into what became spoon bread. Black grandmothers kept it alive through memory, not cookbooks. By the 1990s, it had nearly disappeared. Too much time, too careful a hand, and too hot an oven in July for a dish most younger guests could not even name. Cornbread took its place because cornbread asked for nothing. Number 21, chess pie. Chess pie was nothing more than butter, sugar, eggs, and a splash of vinegar or buttermilk poured into a single crust and baked until the top cracked and turned golden brown. The filling set into something between a custard and a caramel, dense enough to hold its shape on a paper plate in the heat. Nobody knows where the name came from. One story says a woman was asked what kind of pie she made and answered, "It is just pie." Another says the word came from cheese, a colonial term for curd desserts. What mattered was that chess pie required no fruit, no icebox, and no decoration. It was a pantry pie made from what every black kitchen already had on hand. At a 4th of July cookout, chess pie sat on the dessert table between the cobblers and the layer cakes and disappeared first because it was small, sweet, and rich enough that a thin slice was all anyone needed. When bakeries started selling pies by the box, the homemade chess pie stopped showing up. The recipe survived in handwriting on index cards tucked inside cabinet doors. The pie itself did not survive the convenience aisle. Number 20, ambrosia salad. Ambrosia looked like dessert, but occupied the side dish section of the plate. Canned mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, shredded coconut, miniature marshmallows, and either sour cream or Cool Whip folded together and refrigerated overnight. Some versions had pecans, others had maraschino cherries cut in half, turning the whole mixture pink. It sat in a glass bowl next to the baked beans and confused every child who could not figure out why dessert was sharing space with the ribs. Ambrosia was a church recipe brought over from ladies' aid meetings in the 1940s. It held its place on 4th of July tables through the 1980s, then disappeared without a fight. No one under 40 had ever seen a real ambrosia at a cookout by the mid-1990s, and nothing that came after captured the same mix of sweetness and absurdity. Number 19, pimento cheese. Pimento cheese was sharp cheddar grated by hand, mixed with mayonnaise, diced pimentos from a small glass jar, salt, and a pinch of cayenne. Some families added a spoonful of sweet pickle relish. Others kept it plain. The cheese was spread thick on white bread, scooped onto celery sticks, or served in a bowl with saltine crackers beside the grill. It was always cold, always orange, and always gone before the main meat came off the fire. Pimento cheese was a bridge dish, something that filled the gap between arriving at the cookout and eating the real meal. Children ate it on bread. Men ate it standing up with a cracker in one hand. The recipe required no cooking, no oven, and no special skill, just a strong arm and a mixing bowl. When pre-made pimento cheese appeared in plastic tubs at the grocery store, the homemade version lost its purpose. The store-bought kind was smoother, milder, and missing the uneven texture that came from hand grating. The bowl stopped being passed around because nobody made it from scratch anymore. Number 18, creamed corn. Creamed corn was never something from a can. Fresh ears of Silver Queen or Trucker's Favorite was scored down each row with a sharp knife, then scraped hard with the back of the blade until the milky pulp and starch separated from the cob. That thick, sweet mash went into a cast iron skillet with butter, salt, pepper, and just enough whole milk to loosen it into a slow simmer. No flour, no cream. The corn did the thickening on its own. July was the only month this dish existed because that was when the corn came in from the garden or the roadside stand. Families who grew their own picked it the morning of the cookout and shucked it on the back porch with a paper bag between the knees to catch the silk. The difference between fresh scraped cream corn and the canned version sharing the same name was the difference between a kitchen that grew food and a kitchen that bought it. When backyard gardens shrank and farm stands gave way to supermarkets, the skill of scraping corn off the cob left with the generation that learned it from watching, not from reading. Number 17, smoked bologna. Smoked bologna was a poor man's brisket in black communities across Mississippi, Alabama, and East Texas. A whole chub, unsliced, scored in a crosshatch on the outside, rubbed with yellow mustard and dry seasoning, and smoked over wood for 3 to 4 hours until the outside caramelized and the inside turned soft and faintly sweet from the smoke. It was sliced thick and eaten on white bread with mustard and pickles. A 5-pound chub fed a dozen people for almost nothing. Smoked bologna showed up at 4th of July gatherings well into the 1990s in the rural South and in great migration cities like Chicago, where Mississippi families carried the tradition north. It never made it onto a food magazine cover. That was part of its honesty. The price of soul food tells a story most food columns leave out. Turkey legs, smoked hocks, organ meats, the parts white customers walked past at the butcher counter. Black families turned them into dishes that required skill, patience, and generations of knowledge. Then the broader market caught on. What once cost pennies a pound now commands $5, $8, $10. The ingredients that built the 4th of July plate became specialty items priced beyond the reach of the people who created them. The cookout did not shrink because families stopped wanting to cook. It shrank because the grocery bill started costing more than the fireworks. Number 16, vinegar coleslaw. The coleslaw that belonged on a soul food plate was not the creamy white version from a deli counter. It was vinegar, sugar, salt, celery seed, and shredded cabbage that sat in the dressing long enough to soften, but not long enough to go limp. The color was pale green. The taste was sharp and clean and cut through everything heavy on the plate. Vinegar slaw was the counterweight. It sat next to the ribs and the mac and cheese and did the quiet work of keeping the whole meal from tipping into richness. The plate felt wrong without it. By the mid-1990s, creamy slaw from a plastic tub took its place, and the sharpness that held the plate together was gone. Number 15, buttermilk pie. Buttermilk pie was made from ingredients every kitchen already had: eggs, buttermilk, sugar, butter, flour, and vanilla. The filling was whisked in a bowl, poured into a single crust, and baked until the top turned golden and the center just barely stopped trembling. It tasted like vanilla custard with a tang underneath that kept it from tipping into pure sweetness. Buttermilk pie was a Depression-era invention that held its ground at cookout tables for decades because it cost almost nothing and fed a crowd from a single pie pan. Sliced thin, it stretched across 8 or 10 servings. The pie lost its place when grocery store bakeries made buying easier than baking, and a generation grew up never knowing the tang that separated this pie from every other one on the table. Number 14, snap beans and new potatoes. Snap beans for the 4th came from a backyard garden, picked while still thin enough to break clean between two fingers. New potatoes were dug that same morning and dropped whole into the pot. A smoked neck or ham hock went in with water, salt, black pepper, and one dried red pepper pod. The pot held a low roll from morning until mid-afternoon, turning the beans silky and letting the potatoes soak up every grain of smoke. The liquid cooked down into something between a stock and a thin gravy. People spooned it over cornbread or drank it straight from the bowl. What made this dish was not the recipe. What made it was the garden. The beans were alive 2 hours before they hit the water. When family gardens disappeared and subdivisions paved the lots where pole beans once climbed, the dish moved to canned green beans and quartered russets. The name survived. The mourning it required did not. Number 13, stewed squash and onions. Yellow crookneck squash, sliced into thin rounds, was cooked low in a skillet with sliced onions, butter, salt, and pepper until everything softened into a golden heap that held together just enough to serve with a spoon. There was no browning, no crust, no trick to learn. The squash released its own liquid and the onions turned sweet and both collapsed together into something richer than the sum of the parts. It was a July dish because yellow squash came from the garden in midsummer and arrived in more quantity than any family could eat fresh. Stewed squash was how the surplus became a side dish that earned its place on the plate. When backyard gardens shrank and then disappeared, the squash on the cookout table shrank with them. Number 12, macaroni salad. Macaroni salad was the cold counterpart to baked mac and cheese, and at the 4th of July cookout, both showed up on the same table without conflict. Elbow macaroni, boiled and cooled, was folded with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, diced celery, chopped hard-boiled eggs, and paprika. It sat in the refrigerator overnight and was served cold in a large bowl. The texture was soft and tangy and just sweet enough from the relish to catch people who expected something savory. Every family argued about the mustard. Some used enough to turn the whole bowl yellow. Others barely dusted it. Macaroni salad lost ground to store-bought pasta salads in plastic containers that tasted like nothing any grandmother in the yard would have served. The homemade bowl stopped appearing, and nobody in the family stepped up to replace it. Number 11, succotash. Succotash was corn and lima beans cooked together in a heavy pot with butter, salt, pepper, and sometimes a strip of bacon for depth. The corn was cut fresh from the cob. The limas were shelled by hand from pods that grew fat and heavy in the July heat. The two vegetables cooked together until the starches merged and the liquid thickened into a glaze that coated the back of the spoon. Succotash was an indigenous dish adopted and adapted by Black families across the South from Virginia down to East Texas. It was plain food that required no recipe and no instruction beyond watching somebody else make it once. When fresh limas became hard to find outside of farmers markets and frozen corn replaced the ears from the garden, the dish lost the sweetness and the texture that made it worth standing over a hot pot. Number 10, lemon icebox pie. Lemon icebox pie was a Depression-era invention that held on at soul food tables for decades because it required almost nothing. Sweetened condensed milk, egg yolks, and fresh lemon juice mixed together, poured into a graham cracker crust, and set in the refrigerator. No oven needed for the filling, which made it ideal for a July kitchen already running hot from the cobbler and the cornbread. The pie was cold, tart, and sweet in a way no other dessert on the table could touch. It stayed in the back of the refrigerator until the plates were cleared and the chairs pulled into a circle. It faded from cookout tables by the early 2000s, and the spot it held was never properly filled. Number 9, red velvet cake. Red velvet at a 4th of July cookout was not the cream cheese tower from a bakery window. It was a 3-layer cake dyed red with 2 bottles of food coloring stirred into a cocoa buttermilk batter, frosted with a cooked flour frosting that was lighter and less sweet than cream cheese. That frosting required cooking butter, flour, and milk on a stove until thick, then beating it with sugar until it turned white and airy. It produced a texture that melted on the tongue instead of sitting on it. Whoever brought this cake knew it would be compared to every red velvet that came before. The cooked frosting did not survive the shortcut era. Cream cheese took its place, and the original flavor disappeared with the effort. Number 8, fried ham pies. Fried ham pies started more arguments at a cookout than the spades table. Peach families swore by peach. Sweet potato families called peach filling lazy. Apple people kept quiet until someone insulted their crust. Nobody ever switched sides. The pies were half-moon pastries of flour, lard, salt, and cold water, rolled thin, filled with fruit cooked down in sugar, sealed with a fork, and dropped into hot oil until golden. The lard made the crust tender. The frying made it shatter. Enslaved cooks adapted European pastry techniques using whatever fruit and fat were available, and the result passed through generations of black women who fried dozens at a time on brown paper bags to drain. What ended the ham pie was effort and heat. Standing over hot oil on a July afternoon in a kitchen with no air conditioning. As the women who carried the recipe aged out and younger cooks reached for store-bought cobblers, the ham pie left the table. The filling debate went quiet because there was nothing left to argue about. Number 7, coconut cake. Coconut cake was a 3-layer white cake frosted with a cooked 7-minute frosting and covered on every surface with freshly shredded coconut. The coconut was cracked open that morning with a hammer, the white meat pried loose and shredded until it piled high enough to coat the entire cake. The frosting was beaten over simmering water until it turned white, glossy, and stiff enough to hold the shredded coconut in place. Coconut cake was a celebration dessert reserved for holidays and gatherings that carried weight. At the 4th of July, it sat on the table like a centerpiece, towering in white and untouched until somebody finally cut the first slice. Bagged sweetened coconut from a grocery shelf replaced the fresh version by the late 1980s. The flavor changed, the effort was gone. Number 6, cornbread salad. Cornbread salad was built in a glass bowl in layers. Crumbled day-old cornbread, chopped tomatoes, bell peppers, green onions, pinto beans, bacon, and a dressing of mayonnaise, pickle juice, and sour cream. The layers were pressed down and refrigerated until the dressing soaked through the cornbread and held everything together in a mass that scooped out in thick, messy spoonfuls. It was a dish built entirely on leftovers. The cornbread came from the night before. The beans came from whatever sat in the pantry. Cornbread salad showed up at church suppers and 4th of July tables through the 1980s, then faded. The dish required someone to have baked cornbread the day before, which required a kitchen that still treated cornbread as routine. When that routine broke, the salad had no foundation. Number 5, caramel cake. Caramel cake was the most feared dessert in the black kitchen, not because it tasted bad, but because the frosting could fail at any second. Real caramel frosting was made by cooking sugar, butter, and evaporated milk in a heavy pot, stirring constantly until it reached a temperature nobody measured with the thermometer. The cook judged by color, by smell, by the way the mixture dripped from the spoon. 1 degree too far and it seized into candy. 1 degree short and it slid off the cake in a puddle. The woman who could make it consistently earned a respect that went beyond cooking. When canned frosting took over dessert tables, caramel cake did not adapt. It demanded too much to survive a generation unwilling to risk failure at the stove. Number 4, socket to me cake. Socket to me cake was a dense golden bundt cake with a swirl of cinnamon, brown sugar, and pecans running through the center. The batter was thick with sour cream, which gave it a moisture that lasted for days without drying out. It was baked in a fluted tube pan, turned upside down onto a plate, and drizzled with a thin glaze of powdered sugar and milk. The name came from a line on a television comedy show in the late 1960s, and the cake held that playful energy. It was not fancy. It did not try to compete with the layered cakes on a table. It just sat there, uncut, until someone noticed it and sliced off a thick wedge. Once that first piece was gone, the rest followed within the hour. Socket to me cake left cookout tables when bundt pans stopped being standard kitchen equipment and the name stopped meaning anything to the people carrying the plates. Number 3, pecan pie. Pecan pie was the South's claim on the dessert table, and at a Black 4th of July cookout, it occupied the same status as the cobbler and the cake. The filling was dark corn syrup, butter, sugar, eggs, and vanilla, poured over whole pecans, arranged in a single crust, and baked until the top formed a crackled shell that shattered under a fork. The pecans floated to the surface during baking and toasted into a layer that was half candy, half nut. The sweetness was aggressive and unapologetic. Pecan pie required a tree within reach of the family or a neighbor willing to share from a full harvest. When those trees came down for housing developments and parking lots, the pecans moved from the yard to the grocery shelf, and the pie went from a given to a luxury. Number 2, pineapple upside down cake. Pineapple upside down cake started in a cast iron skillet on the stovetop. Butter melted first, then brown sugar spread across the bottom in an even layer. Canned pineapple rings were pressed into the sugar. A maraschino cherry dropped into the center of each ring, and the batter poured over the top. The skillet went into the oven and came out with the fruit side down and the sugar side up, glossy, dark, and caramelized into a shellac that held the pineapple in place. At a Black 4th of July cookout, the upside down cake was the show dessert. It arrived uncovered so everyone could see the rings. The pan was always cast iron because that was what held the heat evenly enough to caramelize the sugar without burning it, and because cast iron was what most Black kitchens had. The cake was sweet, dense, and heavy enough to anchor a paper plate in the wind. When non-stick baking pans replaced cast iron and boxed cake mixes moved the recipe out of the skillet, the upside-down cake lost the flavor that came from a seasoned pan and real butter browned over direct heat. The version that survived tasted cleaner and lighter, which was exactly the problem. Number 1, baked macaroni and cheese. Baked mac and cheese was the center of the plate, not the side, the center. Everything else at the cookout leaned against it. Elbow macaroni, eggs, evaporated milk, butter, and sharp cheddar baked in a deep pan until the top cracked when a spoon broke through. The inside was custard soft. The edges ran dark. No two pans tasted the same. Baked mac and cheese was the dish that proved the family took the fourth seriously. If the mac was wrong, the whole table was suspect. It is still made in some homes today, but rarely from scratch, rarely baked, and rarely in a pan deep enough to matter. The boxed version shares the name. That is where the resemblance ends. 30 dishes, 30 reasons that backyard used to mean something. The smoke before sunrise, the foil-covered plates, the arguments about whose coconut cake was taller, the woman who brought the same spoon bread for 3 decades and never once shared the real ratio, the uncle who started the pit before dawn and ate standing up because he refused to leave the fire. Number 19, peach cobbler. Peach cobbler was the dessert that started fights, the kind of argument families carried for decades about whose crust was flakier and whose grandmother held the only correct recipe. In the 1960s, nearly every black household in the rural South had a peach tree in the yard or a neighbor's, producing more fruit than any family could eat. The cobbler was built in a cast iron skillet greased thick with butter. Flour, butter, sugar, and milk went in the bottom, and sliced peaches tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg went on top. The batter rose around the fruit as it baked into a golden shell that cracked when a spoon pressed through it, and the juice pooled into a warm syrup that tasted like the whole summer in one bite. Church suppers in July were quietly judged by the cobbler table, and the women who won never said a word. By the 1980s, canned peaches replaced fresh in most kitchens, and the cobbler from those cans tasted flat and metallic. The recipe is not lost. The trees are. Number 19, hoe cake. The name was literal. Before the American Revolution, enslaved field workers cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. There was no kitchen, no oven, no table. There was a tool meant for digging, repurposed for cooking, because it was the only flat piece of metal within reach. The earliest written references appear in Virginia plantation records from the 1700s, where overseers noted that enslaved people baked cakes on their hoes during midday breaks. By the early 1800s, hoe cake had migrated indoors. Cast iron griddles replaced the hoe blade, and the recipe appeared in nearly every Southern cookbook published before the Civil War. But the name stuck. Hoe cake, a word that carries inside it the full history of black cooking in America, making something nourishing out of almost nothing, using tools that were never designed for the purpose. The batter itself was the simplest thing imaginable. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, cooked flat until the edges brown. Some versions added a spoonful of lard. Some added buttermilk, but the original needed nothing more than meal, water, and heat. Abraham Lincoln reportedly ate hoe cakes as a child in Kentucky. Frederick Douglass wrote about them. The dish crossed every line of class and color in the antebellum South. And then it vanished. Not because it stopped tasting good, but because the name reminded people of something the country wanted to forget. The garden hoe hanging in the shed became just a garden tool again. The cake baked on it became just cornbread, and the people who invented it became a footnote in someone else's cookbook. Number 24, pinto beans and ham hocks. Open the bag of dry pinto beans, and you're looking at the cornerstone of the 1980s soul food pantry. A pound sold for 50 cents at the Piggly Wiggly, and a single smoked ham hock cost less than $1.50. Soak the beans overnight in a cold pot of water. The next morning, drain them, add the hock, cover with fresh water, and let it bubble all afternoon. The pork fat melted into the broth and turned plain beans into something that tasted like Sunday. Grandmothers in Birmingham and Memphis kept this pot going on the back burner from Monday through Wednesday, adding water as it cooked down. Served over rice with a slice of raw onion on the side, it fed 4 working adults for under $3. Church kitchens used the same trick for fellowship suppers, doubling the recipe in a stock pot the size of a car battery. Pinto beans were the workhorse of every black kitchen that survived the Reagan years. Number 15, blackberry dumplings. Blackberry season lasted about 3 weeks in July, and black children in the rural South knew every bramble patch within walking distance. The berries grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks, and picking them was hot, scratchy work that left hands stained purple for days. The berries cooked down with sugar and water until they burst and the juice turned thick. Strips of biscuit dough dropped in next, covered with a lid, and steamed for 15 minutes. The result was soft dough swimming in dark berry syrup, served warm with cold buttermilk poured on top. This was not a fancy dessert. It was a farm dessert made from what grew free and what the pantry already held. The children who picked those berries earned every bite. They came home with scratched arms, purple-stained shirts, and a bucket heavy enough to require both hands. The dumplings that appeared an hour later were the direct reward for that labor, and they tasted like it. Number 20, Kush. Most people have never heard the word. Kush was yesterday's cornbread, crumbled into a skillet with a little bacon grease and fried until crispy on the outside. Some cookbooks added milk or buttermilk to the pan, turning it into a thick porridge. Others folded in diced onion. The Gullah Geechee version along the coast of South Carolina used crumbled cornbread with cane syrup and butter. Every version started with the same idea. Leftover cornbread was not waste. It was breakfast. In households where bread was baked every day and nothing was thrown out, Kush was the Monday morning answer to Sunday's extra pan. The name may trace back to couscous, carried from West Africa and adapted with the grains available here. By the 1970s, when sliced white bread and boxed cereal took over the morning table, Kush lost its reason to exist. Every recipe so far shares something in common. They required no trip to a store, no brand name, no packaging. Cracklings came from the hog you raised. Tomatoes came from the garden you kept. Poke grew in the ditch beside the road. Cornbread left over from last night became tomorrow's breakfast without anyone calling it a recipe. The entire system was built on what was already there, and that is exactly why the modern food industry had no use for it. You cannot sell a woman what she already grows, kills, preserves, and cooks from memory. The only way to replace her food was to make her children forget she ever knew how to make it. This is where the story reaches further back than the country itself. Number 21, hot water cornbread. The hot water cornbread was the trick that separated grandmothers who could cook from those who only thought they could. Yellow cornmeal went into a wide bowl with a heavy shake of salt on top, and boiling water poured straight from the tea kettle while a wooden spoon stirred fast. The dough firmed up into a thick paste hot enough to burn your hand if you rushed it. Patties were shaped between two wet palms and dropped into half an inch of hot bacon grease in a heavy skillet. 2 minutes aside, crisp golden outside, steamy and soft inside. No oven, no rising time, no buttermilk needed, no eggs to spare. A working mother in Mississippi could put a stack of 6 on a table in under 15 minutes, alongside greens and beans and whatever scrap of pork was bubbling in the pot. Black grandmothers in the Mississippi Delta swore the trick was the tea kettle, not the cornmeal. Hot water cornbread was speed cooking before anybody invented the term. Number 25, tomato sandwich. The simplest summer dish in the Black South started with the tomato still warm from the vine. A thick slice of white bread, a smear of mayonnaise, a tomato cut heavy enough to bend the bread, and a hard shake of salt. That was the whole recipe. In the 1960s, a garden tomato cost nothing. Families in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia grew them by the bushel along fence lines and beside the porch steps. Children ate them like apples, straight off the vine with salt in their pockets. The supermarket tomato that replaced it was bred for shipping durability and picked a green. It looked the same. It tasted like cardboard. Anyone who has eaten both knows the difference without needing a laboratory to confirm it. Number 23, fried bologna sandwiches. And by 1983, when generic store brand bologna sat at under $1 a pound and Oscar Mayer ran closer to $2, Black mothers across the Midwest had perfected the art of frying both. A thick slice went into a hot grease pan with a small slit cut into each side to keep it from puffing up like a balloon. The edges crisp to brown, the middle stayed soft, and the smell filled the kitchen in under a minute. 2 slices of cheap white bread, a smear of French's yellow mustard, a slice of American cheese if payday had hit, and a leaf of iceberg lettuce if you had it. This was the after-school plate for the latchkey kids of Detroit and Cleveland whose mothers worked second shift at the hospital or the post office. The sandwich was assembled in 3 minutes flat and eaten in front of cartoons at 4:30 in the afternoon. A small glass of Kool-Aid washed it down. Fried bologna was the snack that became supper when the paycheck was 3 days late. Number 17, corn on the cob. Sweet corn was picked in July when the kernels were still milky and tender, and it went into boiling water within the hour. The silk was stripped on the porch, and children fought over who got the biggest ear. It was boiled in salted water, then rolled in butter until the surface glistened. At summer cookouts, ears went directly on the grill grate over charcoal, with the husk still on, roasted until the outer leaves blackened and curled. Pulling back that charred husk to reveal steaming corn underneath was one of the quiet rituals of summer that nobody photographed, because nobody imagined it would ever stop. The butter melted on contact and pooled in the rows between the kernels. Children ate it holding both ends, turning the ear like a typewriter roller, faces shining with grease. Number 21, sweet potato pone. This was not sweet potato pie and not sweet potato casserole. Sweet potato pone was older than both. The recipe appeared in handwritten church cookbooks from the 1880s across Georgia, Alabama, and the Mississippi Delta. Raw sweet potatoes were grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with molasses, butter, eggs, and spices, then baked slow until the top cracked and the center set dense and dark, almost like a pudding. It took close to 2 hours in a wood-fired oven. The texture was heavy, somewhere between cornbread and fudge, and it was eaten warm with nothing on top. Grating enough sweet potato for a family of 8 meant raw knuckles and sore arms. When canned sweet potatoes and pre-made pie crust showed up in stores in the 1950s, sweet potato pone was one of the first recipes to drop out of the rotation. Nobody noticed until the hands that grated them were gone. Number 25, smothered neck bones. The neck bone was the cheapest pork on the meat counter in 1982, and black grandmothers knew it better than the butcher behind the case did. A pound went for under $1 in most southern grocery stores, and one 3-pound package fed a household of 6 on a Sunday if you stretched it right. The bones went into a heavy pot with chopped onion, garlic powder, a splash of cider vinegar, a bay leaf, and water enough to cover by an inch. 2 hours of low simmering pulled the marrow into the gravy, and the meat slid off the bone with the gentle pull of a fork. Working mothers in Detroit and Atlanta put this pot on before church on Sunday morning and came home at noon to dinner already made and waiting. A scoop of long-grain white rice underneath caught the gravy, and a slice of soft white bread mopped the plate clean at the end. The neck bone was poor man's meat with rich man's flavor. Number 16, chow relish. Chow was the condiment that went on everything and came from whatever the garden produced faster than anyone could eat. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers were chopped fine, mixed with vinegar and sugar, and cooked until the kitchen smelled sharp and sweet at the same time. Families across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee sealed it in jars beside the watermelon rind pickles, and it lasted into the following spring. Chow turned a plain plate of beans and cornbread into something with bite. The relish aisle at the grocery store today carries nothing that resembles what came out of those kitchens. The commercial versions are sweeter, blander, and missing the vinegar edge that made the original cut through a plate of heavy food. A grandmother's chow had teeth, It woke the palate between bites of pork and beans and greens, and it turned a plain supper into something layered. Number 16, ash cake. Before there were ovens in most rural homes, there was fire. Ash cake was cornmeal dough shaped by hand, wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, and buried directly in the hot ashes of a hearth fire. It baked slowly from all sides. When it was pulled out and the leaves peeled away, the outside was dark and smoky, and the inside was dense and steaming. The method was ancient. Variations of it appear in cooking traditions across West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South. The oldest plantation records mention ash cake as the primary bread of enslaved people before the 1830s. It required no pan, no oven, no fuel beyond the fire already burning for warmth. When cast iron became widely available after the Civil War, ash cake disappeared almost overnight. Number 20, red beans and rice. Pour the dry red beans into a heavy pot Monday night, cover them in cold water, and soak them through until morning, and you had the foundation of Tuesday supper in every Louisiana Black household. Tuesday was wash day, and red beans needed almost no watching while sheets and work shirts hung on the line out back. A smoked turkey neck, a cut up yellow onion, 2 cloves of garlic, a bay leaf, a shake of Tony Chachere's, and fresh water to cover. The pot simmered low for 4 hours while everything else got done around the house. The beans broke down into their own thick gravy, served over hot white rice with a square of cornbread on the side and a splash of vinegar pepper sauce on top. It fed 5 working people for under $2.50 in 1984 dollars. Red beans were the Tuesday tradition that crossed state lines through the Great Migration. That was the 4th of July. Not the fireworks, not the parade, the plate. Drop the one dish your family brought every single year without fail, the one that told everybody the table was ready. If you grew up eating from those plates, you already know which one it was. And if somebody in your family still makes it the old way from scratch, make sure the next generation learns before it walks out the door for good.